You write a check, and you think, oh, you know, I did something nice, right? But it didn't mean that I went and helped those people I wrote a check for. And this medieval idea, it's this idea that this is also meant to bring about a kind of interaction, and that one can study it that way, that it's social interaction, as much as it is kind of an act, right? That's where you could, in some ways, say about modern charity, this is an act that maybe, say, rich people do, and it separates them almost in a way from the poor. The idea here is that it brings them together. The other thing is that, you know, I've been saying, oh, medieval people seem to want to do charity, right? I don't want you to think all medieval people are like, yes, charity, you know, it's great. One case we have where we know that people didn't like a form of charity they're supposed to do is people hated hospitality. I mean, they did not want to do this. And we have all kinds of cases. And I even actually wrote about this in the 9th century. Cases where you can just tell that these Carolingian aristocrats living under like the rule of Charlemagne and his sons, they do not want to give hospitality to pilgrims or to travelers. It's clear they must consider it kind of a pain. And if you think about it, would we all like to have random pilgrims showing up at our doorstep expecting us to feed and house them? I mean, you're like, yeah, you don't know who they are. Would they steal from you? Would they be dirty? You know, I mean, there's all kinds of things you can imagine. There's resistance to this, and you see this in the Middle Ages. It's one thing, right, to be told you should interact with the poor, you should give them things, you should, you know, provide services to them. It's another thing to take them into your own house, right? That's a big difference. And we do see resistance to that in the Middle Ages, but a lot of Christians don't like that. The other thing is, it's important to know that actually if you went on crusade, that was considered a charitable act. I would hope now we would all think that going on crusade is, if anything, the reverse of a charitable act, that this is the opposite of humanitarianism, right? Crusaders did some really horrible things. And so that's something that we would probably not want to categorize as charity, but they did. They thought of it as a charitable act. The other thing that they did is they made really clear-cut distinctions between what they refer to as the deserving poor and the undeserving. And they would make these distinctions. So the deserving are the ones I already mentioned, right? Widows, orphans, who am I forgetting? Widows, orphans, and someone else. The sick, yes, the sick. These are the people who, through no fault of their own, can't help themselves. However, if someone shows up in the city because they've come from the countryside, they've been displaced somehow, and they're looking for work and they can't find it and they're poor, you think medieval people thought they were deserving? No. They often said, oh, they're lazy, they're undeserving. They could work, they just need to do that, right? They don't just deserve charity, right? So that's another example. Another example that of groups of people who are often considered undeserving is we actually have charters. So these are documents of hospitals that lay out kind of the rules for hospitals. And some of these hospitals, they had certain categories of people they just utterly rejected. So they would say, no lepers can be in our hospital. I'm going to talk about lepers in a minute, so you'll see a little bit more why they might say absolutely no lepers. So no lepers, you might think, well, the lepers are sick, right? Don't they need help? But they would say not in a hospital, right? They have to go somewhere else, or to their own hospital. They would reject prostitutes a lot of times. Absolutely not. Doesn't matter how poor or how sick a prostitute gets, you know, she's a prostitute, right? And so a lot of times some groups would take her. But also the mentally ill. People we would categorize as mentally ill. Medieval people didn't have really a concept like that, right? They don't have, you know, psychiatry yet. They don't know that. But they would often say, well, those people, no. And sometimes they would say, oh, maybe they're possessed by a demon. And so they would say, no, we can't have these people around. So that's important to note, is that when medieval people said poor, they often had kind of an idealized poor in mind, right? It's not just that you lack money, it's like you're a certain category of people who lack money. So one group that is definitely the deserving and the obvious are orphans. It's important to know when you hear this word hospital, I mean, now we have such a medical association with that word, and we think, oh, if it's a hospital, they're taking care of the sick. But in the Middle Ages, actually, a lot of hospitals were not there to like take sick people in and cure them and then send them on their way. Hospitals typically did two things. One is that you have a foundling hospital like this one. This is the Hospital of the Innocenti, right? And it's quite famous architecturally in Florence. It's a picture of it. Begun in 1419, it's considered one of the great classics of Renaissance architecture. But it was a place that orphans could go. And this was a world in which a lot of people died in accidents, and a lot of people died from disease. There was a lot more death. Again, this whole idea that medieval people were maybe more in contact with death. There's a lot more death at younger ages than we're used to, so that lots of parents could end up dying. And then where did their children go? for a long time, all the way from the beginnings of Christianity until really today, there's this emphasis that orphans are exceptionally deserving, right? Children through no fault of their own, they deserve to be taken care of. So this is probably like a classic kind of thing that you think of as a charity. But maybe something that you probably haven't heard of are lay confraternities, and these were really popular. A confraternity is simply like a brotherhood, right? I mean, that's all that word really means. And it's where like the modern fraternities come from, right? That, it's a group of men. And most of these were for men, although there were female equivalents. And they developed in cities, and usually they had a certain focus on something. So popular things that they focused on here in their devotions was they would say, oh, we're going to be devoted to the Corpus Christi. That is to the body of Christ. That's the idea of the suffering Christ, especially. They put a lot of emphasis on that. Or they would say, oh, whatever local saint. That was very popular too. So whatever city they were in, the most favorite local saint, a lot of confraternities would focus their devotions on that. Or to Mary, right? I already said was really popular. And they did different things. Now, not every lay confraternity did all of these things, but they would do some of these. So they certainly were penitent. The idea is that you join one of these as an act of penance. You have to give your time and your money to it. It's an organization that provides certain charitable acts, and so it can be a form of penance. You can also carry out group acts of penance together. They also would do things like they would try to take care of the burial of the dead, visit the sick, clothe the poor, give orphan girls dowries. Now that one might sound a little odd, but in the Middle Ages, if you didn't have a dowry, you couldn't get married. And this was actually a big kind of charitable thing to do, especially, most famously, there's an organization for this in Florence that we have a lot of documentation for. But we're pretty sure this happened in many places, right? That you gotta get money together to give girls dowries. And in some ways, we have the best evidence for this in Italy in the late Middle Ages. This is a very famous painting. If any of you taken art history, you might have studied it. It's now in Venice, and it depicts Venice. So I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the city of Venice, but this is the most famous square in Venice. It's the Piazza San Marco, right? And so if you look here, this is the Church of San Marco, right? The Church of St. Mark. St. Mark is the patron saint of Venice. And it's this big square in Venice. And you can see they're having a procession. So you can see all these people are walking, right? And here you see they have like a special canopy. And then you can't really see it very well, but down here there's like a big reliquary. It's a special box for a holy object. And in this case, it's a piece of the true cross. So the artist's name here is Gentile Bellini. And the title of the painting, at least in the modern world, is Procession of the Relic of the True Cross. He painted it in 1496. This is the very end of the Middle Ages, right? And he did it for the Scuola di San Giovanni Evangelista. So what this is this is, if you put that in English, it's kind of like the confraternity of St. John the Evangelist. This was a very powerful confraternity in Venice. And what you see depicted in the painting is it's set in 1444. So it's a historical painting. It's a specific moment. It's set in 1444, and it's on the feast day of St. Mark, and they are processing with their relic of the true cross. So I want to show you, because this is a kind of charity that I think not so many people know about in the Middle Ages, but it was a popular form of charity, right? You're in a group, and as a group, you can do more than you could on your own. So the people who belonged to this were often merchants. Now, so they're not poor, but, don't get me wrong, these are not people who need charity necessarily themselves, but they're not aristocrats either. They're not kings or queens, right? They don't have tons and tons of disposable income, right? But if they all come together and they can perform charitable acts, they can become kind of powerful in a way in that sense. And this is where they're providing that secular and spiritual leadership. If you look at this would have been a huge religious event for people, right? To see this procession that took place. And people would have, who were not in this confraternity would have really taken notice. And it was a moment for other people to have kind of a spiritual experience, a devotional experience. Processions were important moments of devotional practice in the Middle Ages. And so, but if you think about it, this is something that is being provided in some senses by a group of laymen, right? For this city. And it gives them a chance to have spiritual leadership. And you got to keep in mind that in the medieval church, there's not many places for most people to have any kind of leadership role, right? Women, of course, can't be priests. They can't preach. So women are utterly cut off from all kinds of activities. And equally, laymen can't preach. Equally, it's important to know both all laity and all women, so even women who are nuns, they can't go up on the altar. They can't approach it. They can't get too close. It's all cut off to them. And there have been lots of medievals who've written about this, that this actually was bothersome to some people, right? That it can make you feel like maybe not quite engaged. And so some people have suggested you participate in this kind of activity to make yourself feel engaged in your own religion, right? This gives you a chance to be kind of a spiritual leader. But if you think about it, look at all these people in this procession. I mean, this is a clear demonstration. These people had secular power too, right? If you want something to happen in the city of Venice, don't you think it might be worth your time to try to cultivate good relationships with this confraternity, to get them on your side? And this is also, as much as it's a demonstration of kind of spirituality and all of that, you can also look at it, this is a demonstration of power. They're showing off their numbers and their might and their ability to engage the city of Venice in these activities, right? And just think, they're able to hire a very prominent artist at this time to paint this very beautiful painting for them. So this is an important kind of act of charity to think about. So these confraternities are not just in Italy. I know I've given you those examples in Italy. They're across Europe, but they're very important. So I'm going to talk about lepers. Everybody likes lepers, right? So I kind of save them in some ways near the end because, you know, as attention may be flaggy, but lepers can always keep people's attention. So leprosy is a disease that we're not familiar with in the United States because, you know what, you can cure it with antibiotics, right? You catch it, it's just not an issue. So we don't, in the kind of modern first world, even second world, you don't see leprosy much. It's pretty easy to cure, but it took people a long time to know how to do that, right? So if you go back to the Middle Ages, leprosy was something that people were really afraid of. And one of the reasons they're so afraid of it is because it makes people look really scary. So I'm going to show you some modern medical pictures from medical texts, just to give you an idea of what leprosy does to the human body. Now, we're not used to seeing this, right? We don't see this in our society, but it does things like it will make your digits, like on your hands and your feet, fall off, so you lose your fingers and toes, you lose ears, you lose your nose, because it atrophies and it's just dead and it comes off of you, and it will blind you. It does all kinds of horrible things to you. So I'm grossing you out with a purpose, right? So I'll get off the gross slides. And the reason I'm grossing you out is I think sometimes we look back at the Middle Ages and we say, oh, these people were so backwards and kind of hateful. But I mean, I really think we would have to be challenged ourselves. How many of us, if we saw someone like that and we didn't really understand where the disease comes from, would we go up and approach them and want to be right close next to them? Especially if we feared that we would catch that disease too, right? No, I mean, they were scary for a reason. And we shouldn't look back and say, oh, they were foolish. We should look back and say, they didn't understand this, right? And they had to try to explain it. And what's interesting is that over the course of the Middle Ages, more and more lepers come to be seen as Christ-like. They get this association. That's why I have this image here that you can see, right? Christ is blessing a leper. And you can tell, like, medieval artists have a hard time depicting leprosy, but that's typically what they look like in medieval illuminations, right? They have the little dots. And there is a concept that the lepers became like Christ because they suffered bodily. Their experience in this world was like the experience of Christ when he was in this world, that they are suffering the way he did. And so medieval people in some cases came to associate lepers as being Christ-like, and for that reason that they could be good intercessors too. And again, that's that idea that you pray to, like, say, a saint,